I'm standing before the rusty gates of an abandoned prison, a place that once held thousands of restless souls. In this video, I'll share the terrifying experiences and supernatural phenomena I witnessed firsthand during nights spent wandering its cold, dark corridors filled with whispers. Get ready to step into a place where the line between life and death becomes razor thin. I still remember that cold evening vividly, the moment I approached the rusted, iron gates of the abandoned prison that had stood silently for decades. This place wasn't just an old, crumbling building. It was a repository of countless dark stories, a shell housing the lingering pain and despair of thousands of souls who had once been trapped inside. The gates groaned loudly as I pushed them open, the metallic screech echoing through the cold night air like a warning meant only for me. It was as if the prison itself was alive, breathing, warning me of what lay ahead. The air was biting, heavy with a dampness that seeped through the thickest layers of clothing, chilling me to my very bones. The silence was overwhelming, complete and almost unnatural. Not a bird chirped, no distant cars passed, only the whisper of the cold wind brushing against broken glass and peeling paint. The courtyard lay in ruins, cracked concrete littered with leaves and debris, faint moonlight revealing the scars of time etched on the walls. As I stepped forward, my boots crunched against shards of glass and scattered stones, each step a reminder that I was crossing into a realm where the past refused to remain buried. The prison loomed ahead, massive, foreboding, its windows like hollow eyes watching my every move. Peeling layers of paint hung like tattered skin, and the heavy air carried with it a faint but unmistakable scent of mold, rust, and decay. My heart began to race as I reached for my flashlight. Its weak beam pierced the darkness, illuminating the corridor that led deeper inside. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, shadows pooling in every corner, creeping along the floor like living things. The walls, once painted a dull gray, were now stained and cracked, covered in graffiti that told silent stories of rebellion, despair, and hopelessness. With every step, the weight of the building's history pressed down on me, tangible and heavy. The echoes of long-past screams seemed to reverberate through the cold stone, mixing with the distant drip of water leaking somewhere far away. I imagined the prisoners who had paced these halls, their footsteps now faint whispers in the night, their cries swallowed by the unforgiving walls. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept through the corridor, carrying with it a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a chill racing down my spine. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to decipher if what I heard was real or just the tricks of my imagination playing with the night sounds. The silence returned, thicker than before, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every nerve in my body was alert. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears and the shallow rhythm of my breathing. The prison was not merely a building. It was a living memory, and I was intruding on its long-held secrets. I spoke quietly into my recorder, hoping to capture evidence of the unknown. I'm here, and I'm listening. The beam of my flashlight caught movement for a split second. Was it a shadow? A trick of the light? I wasn't sure. My eyes darted to every corner, but all I could see were the remnants of decay and darkness. The silence stretched on, pressing on my mind, making every small sound feel like a signal, every flicker of light like a warning. I ventured further, entering what had once been the main cell block. The cold air was thicker here, each breath a visible puff in the dim light. The cells lined the hall like tombs, their iron bars rusted but still menacing. Faded numbers hung above each cell door, reminders of those who had been locked away and forgotten by the world. I paused in front of one cell, running my hand along the cold metal bars. A sudden drop in temperature brushed past me, sharper than anything I had felt before. I shivered involuntarily, but forced myself to move on. There was no turning back now. As I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoed and bounced off the walls, creating a haunting rhythm. I imagined the countless nights prisoners must have spent pacing these halls, wrestling with fear, loneliness, and despair. The thought was suffocating, and yet strangely compelling. This place wasn't just about walls and bars. It was about human suffering, and the echoes of those tormented souls seemed to linger like ghosts, waiting to be heard. The further I went, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the prison was drawing me in deeper, forcing me to confront its darkest secrets. The line between past and present, reality and nightmare, began to blur. I knew that what I was about to experience would test every shred of my courage and belief. And so, with a deep breath to steady my nerves, I stepped fully into the darkness, ready to uncover the stories hidden in this forsaken place. What I saw, heard, and felt in the nights to come would forever change my understanding of fear, reality, and the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. If you're ready to join me on this journey, light your flashlight, hold your breath, and step inside. The abandoned prison awaits. The first night inside the prison was unlike anything I had ever encountered. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, plunging the building into darkness, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The once dormant, crumbling structure seemed to awaken, exhaling a breath heavy with decades of sorrow, pain, and lingering anguish. Every fiber of my being tensed, senses sharpening to a razor's edge, as if the very walls were watching and listening to my every move. I gripped my flashlight tightly, its weak beam trembling slightly in the cool night air. With every step, the cold stone floor echoed beneath my boots, a hollow sound that bounced off the peeling paint and cracked walls. The silence was profound, so absolute that even the faintest noise seemed magnified beyond reason. Somewhere deep within the maze of corridors, I caught the steady drip of water falling, slow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock counting down an unspoken fate. As I advanced deeper, a long, mournful sigh floated down the hallway. It was not a breath belonging to any living soul, but an exhalation drenched in despair and centuries-old fatigue. The sound wrapped around me, slow and heavy, chilling my spine as it wound through the air like a spectral lament. I froze, breath caught in my throat, heart pounding fiercely against my ribs. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, shadows pooling in corners, while the faint light of my flashlight wavered over the crumbling surfaces. The sigh seemed to grow louder, closer, as though an unseen entity drifted just behind me, breathing down my neck. I swung my beam rapidly from side to side, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Yet there was only the oppressive blackness, thick, impenetrable, and cold. My skin prickled as a sudden chill swept past me, carrying the faintest scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood or rust. A pang of unease coiled in my stomach. Was I truly alone? The sighing persisted, ebbing and flowing in a rhythm that matched the pace of my heartbeat, sometimes soft and distant, sometimes near and pressing. The building's sorrow seemed to seep into my very bones. Turning down a narrow side corridor, I approached a series of cells, tiny, claustrophobic cages that once held men and women condemned to endless confinement. The iron bars were cold to the touch, rusted and worn, stained with years of neglect. I ran my hand over the cold metal, trying to imagine the lives trapped within, their cries muffled by the stone and steel. Then, from one of the cells, a faint scraping sound broke the silence, soft, deliberate. It was the gentle scratch of fingernails against rough concrete. My breath hitched sharply. I pointed my flashlight towards the noise, heart hammering, but there was no movement, no shape, only shadows swallowing the light. I swallowed my fear and pressed record on my voice recorder. "Is anyone here?" I whispered. "I'm here to listen, not to harm." The reply was silence, but beneath that silence, the weight of countless stories lingered, telling of despair, broken dreams, and lives stolen by cold metal bars. As I moved further, the old observation room came into view. Once a hub for guards watching the prisoners, it was now a hollow shell of peeling paint and shattered glass. The door creaked open before me, releasing a stale breath of air. Suddenly, behind me, a heavy door slammed shut with a thunderous bang that echoed through the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, flashlight beam darting frantically, but no one was there. The wind was still, the silence pressed and even thicker. The door's slam wasn't caused by any gust or disturbance. It was a deliberate, chilling announcement from the shadows. I steadied my nerves, turning on the recorder once more. Faint whispers drifted just beyond the range of comprehension, soft, unintelligible murmurs that sent shivers cascading down my spine. They felt like fragments of voices long lost to time, trapped between these walls, begging to be heard. I spent the remainder of the night walking these corridors, eyes peeled for any sign, ears straining for any sound beyond my own footsteps. Every creak, every gust, every distant drip of water felt charged with meaning. The darkness wasn't empty. It was alive, breathing stories of pain, regret, and unfinished business. I tried to rest on the cold concrete floor, but sleep was impossible. The prison's presence pressed on me relentlessly, a mix of cold, silence, and unseen eyes watching and waiting. I realized then that this place was far more than bricks and mortar. It was a living graveyard of souls trapped between worlds. That first night etched itself into my memory like a dark brand, a solemn reminder that some places carry burdens that time can never erase. And as dawn slowly broke, I knew that the journey through the prison's shadows was only beginning. The night deepened, and as I moved further into the ancient corridors of the prison, the air seemed to grow even colder. A silence so profound settled around me that my footsteps sounded deafening, like the beating of a war drum in the stillness. The broken windows allowed shards of moonlight to scatter across the floor in uneven patches, painting the shadows in ghostly silver hues. I came to the old cell block, where the prison's most infamous stories had been whispered for generations. This was the place said to hold the spirit of a prisoner who had never found peace, a man condemned not just in life, but in death. Standing at the threshold, I hesitated. The rusty bars before me were thick and unyielding, yet it felt as though an unseen barrier pulsed beyond them, a veil between this world and the next. The atmosphere was heavy, weighted with decades of sorrow, anger, and isolation. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath formed visible clouds in the air, and a shiver ran uncontrollably down my spine. It was then that I saw him, a faint, wavering figure emerging from the darkness of the furthest cell. He was dressed in a tattered prisoner's uniform, the fabric hanging loosely from his emaciated frame. His face was pale, gaunt, and marked by time and torment. But what struck me most were his eyes, hollow wells of infinite sadness and pain. They met mine with an intensity that froze me in place, rooting me to the spot like a statue. This was no apparition born from imagination or shadows. This was the lonely prisoner, a spirit trapped in eternal despair. He did not move toward me. Instead, he stood silently, a ghostly sentinel, as if guarding the memories of his suffering. The heavy silence was punctuated only by the distant drip of water and the soft rustling of the cold wind sneaking through the cracks in the walls. For several long moments, we simply stared at one another, me trembling with a mixture of fear and empathy, him weighed down by the invisible chains of his fate. I felt his pain seeping into my soul, an overwhelming grief that spoke of years spent behind these bars, suffering in loneliness and despair. I tried to speak, to break the silence. Who are you? Why do you stay here? My voice was barely above a whisper, swallowed by the stillness. No answer came, only a subtle sigh, a sound so laden with sorrow it felt as if the entire prison mourned alongside him. Suddenly, a faint, mournful moan echoed softly through the corridor, weaving through the stone like a lament carried on a cold wind. It was the sound of lives lost, of dreams shattered and hopes crushed. The air around me thickened with an invisible heaviness, and I felt as though the very walls wept with the weight of their memories. Despite the terror, I found myself drawn deeper into this encounter. I reached out a trembling hand, but the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows from which he had appeared. The coldness lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. I stood alone again, the echoes of that silent meeting ringing in my ears. It was a reminder that this prison was not merely a building of stone and iron, but a vessel containing the souls of those who had suffered within its confines, souls still trapped, still crying out for release. As I moved onward, The prison seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, and I realized that I was only beginning to scratch the surface of its haunted legacy. Each step forward was a step further into the unknown, where the past was alive and restless, and I knew then that the journey ahead would test every ounce of my courage. The deeper I ventured into the labyrinthine corridors of the prison, the more oppressive the darkness became. The faint beam of my flashlight danced across cracked walls and shattered windows, barely cutting through the thick veil of shadow that clung to every surface like a second skin. Each step I took was cautious, deliberate, aware that I was walking through the echoes of countless stories left untold. As I rounded a corner, the silence was suddenly broken by a spine-chilling sound, the creak of an old wooden door slowly opening. What startled me most was that no one was near the door. No breeze whispered through this part of the prison, and yet the door groaned as if pushed by an unseen hand. Frozen in place, I trained my flashlight on the doorway. The door was old, warped by time, its rusty hinges protesting every inch it moved. Through the narrow opening, nothing but impenetrable darkness awaited. But even in that darkness, I felt eyes watching, waiting. The creak came again, slow, deliberate, like a beckoning call or a sinister challenge. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat loud and echoing against the cold stone. A cold wave washed over me, making the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Yet, despite every instinct screaming to flee, I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the room beyond. The air inside was stale and thick with decay. My flashlight revealed walls scarred with deep scratches and gouges, signs of desperate struggles from a long-forgotten past. The floor was littered with debris and dust that swirled faintly as I moved. The faint, musty scent of mold mixed with something metallic and bitter, blood, perhaps, or rust. As I ventured deeper, an overwhelming silence engulfed the room, broken only by the soft echo of my breathing. Then, from somewhere deep within, came a long, sorrowful sigh, a sound so laden with grief and regret that it seemed to carry the weight of countless years. It resonated through the space, weaving around me like a mournful spirit's lament. I stood motionless, every nerve taut with fear and awe. The sigh seemed almost alive, a living echo of pain that refused to be silenced. My flashlight flickered as if struggling against the darkness, casting erratic shadows that twisted and turned like phantom figures on the walls. Unable to move, I listened. The sigh was followed by a faint whisper, unintelligible but unmistakably human. It lingered, a soft murmur of names, places, and memories lost to time. It was as if the room itself was trying to communicate, to reach out from beyond the grave. Suddenly, the air grew colder. A gust of wind swept through the room, though there was no window or opening to explain it. I felt a chill wrap around me, penetrating my jacket and chilling me to the bone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Then, almost as suddenly as it had opened, the door creaked shut behind me with a sharp slam that made my heart leap into my throat. I whirled around, shining my light at the door, but it was firmly closed, its surface cold and unyielding. For a moment, the room fell silent again, thick, heavy, as though holding its breath. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to steady myself. The experience felt like a crossing between two worlds, the threshold where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. I backed out cautiously, retreating from the room, feeling the eyes that had been watching me all along. The door shut behind me with one last, mournful creak, a ghostly farewell that echoed long after I had left. As I walked away, the weight of what I had experienced pressed on me. That door was not just a physical barrier, but a symbolic boundary between the tangible and the intangible, the known and the unknown, the living and the dead. I knew then that many more secrets lay hidden within this prison's walls, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. And I was just beginning to unravel the threads of its haunted history. The corridors of the prison stretched out before me like a twisted maze, seemingly endless and swallowed by shadows so deep they felt almost tangible. The cold stone walls were rough to the touch, slick with moisture and years of neglect, and the faint smell of mold lingered in the stale air. My footsteps echoed loudly, every step amplified by the vast emptiness that surrounded me. The beam of my flashlight quivered in my hand, casting long, jittering shadows that leapt and swayed across the cracked walls. Each breath I took hung in the air as a faint mist, and my heart pounded fiercely in my chest, the rhythm irregular and anxious. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, making every tiny noise stand out. The distant drip of water from a leaking pipe, the soft rustling of rats skittering unseen, even the faint creak of the building settling on its ancient foundation. Suddenly, from behind me, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, urgent, and deliberate. The noise shattered the silence like a gunshot. My blood turned to ice as adrenaline surged through me. I froze, every muscle taut with fear, and swung my flashlight back over my shoulder. But the darkness beyond revealed nothing. No figure, no shadow, no flicker of movement. Just an empty hallway stretching into oblivion. Yet the footsteps persisted, pounding relentlessly against the cold concrete floor, closing in on me with chilling precision. They matched my pace perfectly. When I slowed, they slowed. When I quickened, they quickened. The sound was sharp and clear, unlike any echo or trick of acoustics I'd ever heard. It was as if someone, or something, was chasing me through the maze of stone. My breath caught in my throat. A suffocating panic gripped my chest as I bolted forward, desperate to escape whatever haunted these halls. The footsteps thundered behind me like the heartbeat of some invisible predator. Each step a cold reminder that I was not alone. I twisted down a narrow corridor, heart hammering against my ribs, trying to keep my footing on the slippery floor. The walls closed in around me, claustrophobic and damp, shadows flickering in the dim flashlight beam. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it real? Was I hallucinating? Or was I being hunted by a restless spirit trapped in these ruins? I dared not look back again, though the sound of footsteps seemed to draw closer with every frantic breath I took. The pounding was deafening in my ears now, relentless, unyielding presence that sent shivers crawling over my skin. Twice I stopped and spun around, shining my light into the void behind me, searching desperately for the source. But no one was there. Only darkness, thick, impenetrable, and suffocating. A cold sweat broke over me, despite the chill in the air. My hands trembled uncontrollably, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The silence that followed those sudden stops was heavier than before, filled with an almost tangible sense of menace. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps ceased. The echo died away, leaving me in a deafening silence, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. I stood there, chest heaving, sweat slicking my skin, feeling utterly exposed and vulnerable. The loneliness of the place wrapped around me like a shroud, amplifying every fear and doubt. As I looked down the dimly lit corridor, the shadows seemed to pulse and shift with a life of their own. I felt eyes watching me from the darkness, unseen but palpable, pressing down with the weight of centuries of sorrow and rage. I realized then that these footsteps were not random echoes. They were the restless spirits of those who had suffered here, trapped in an endless loop of fear and despair. Their presence was a haunting reminder of the pain etched into every stone, every corner of this forsaken prison. A sudden chill swept through the hallway, and the faint scent of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. I knew that this place was alive with more than memories. It was alive with anguish, with the echoes of lives lost and never forgotten. I pressed record on my voice recorder, whispering into the darkness, "I know you're here. I'm listening." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a faint, sorrowful whisper drifted through the air, barely audible but unmistakably human. It was a plea, a cry for recognition, a call from beyond the grave. I stood motionless, letting the weight of that whisper settle deep into my bones. The footsteps might have stopped, but their presence lingered, a spectral shadow that followed me through every step of this harrowing journey. And I knew this was only the beginning. There were many more stories hidden in these walls, many more restless souls seeking release. My heart still pounding, I gathered my courage and moved onward, deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder as I approached one of the most infamous areas of the prison, Cell 13. From countless whispered tales and local lore, this cell had long been considered the epicenter of the prison's most intense hauntings. It was said that the suffering endured there transcended even death, binding a spirit in eternal torment. The heavy iron door, thick and rusted with decades of neglect, loomed before me like a barrier between two worlds, the living and the dead. I hesitated for a moment, my breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The silence around the cell was so dense it pressed into my ears, muffling all other sounds. The faint light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness that seeped from beneath the door's edges, as if the shadows themselves were spilling out to claim the hallway. As I slowly reached out and grasped the cold metal handle, a sharp gust of frigid air blasted past me, sending a chill so fierce it made my skin crawl. The door groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing a pitch-black interior that seemed to swallow the light whole. I hesitated at the threshold, fighting the instinct to turn away and flee, but something deeper, curiosity mingled with an unshakable sense of purpose, drew me inside. Stepping over the threshold, I was immediately engulfed by a darkness so complete it was as if I had plunged into another realm. The flashlight in my hand flickered erratically before stabilizing, its feeble beam barely illuminating the cracked and crumbling walls of the tiny cell. The cold was oppressive, biting into my bones with merciless persistence. Every breath I took felt like icy needles scraping my lungs. A profound silence dominated the room, broken only by the faint, distant dripping of water. It was the kind of silence that presses upon the soul, thick with unseen energy. I could feel the weight of history here, decades of anguish, despair, and violence compressed into the four damp walls. Suddenly, whispers began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they were faint, unintelligible murmurs curling around the edges of perception. Then, as my eyes adjusted and my heart steadied, the whispers grew more distinct, urgent, mournful, filled with anguish. Words seemed to brush past my ears, fragments of sorrowful confessions and unspoken regrets. The voices twisted and danced just beyond comprehension, like echoes from a past too painful to be fully remembered. I tried to turn on my voice recorder to capture these spectral murmurs, but in that instant, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. A wave of panic surged through me. I fumbled with the switch, heart racing, but the light refused to return. The blackness was suffocating, thick and alive, wrapping around me like a living shroud. I stood frozen, every sense heightened, straining to hear and feel what lurked unseen. The whispers persisted, a haunting symphony of despair, swirling around me in the pitch-black cell. A cold breath brushed past my neck, slow and deliberate, sending icy fingers down my spine. A presence drew near, heavy unseen, but palpably close. I could hear the faintest of breaths, slow and labored, almost like the exhale of a tortured soul. My skin prickled with a mixture of fear and awe. The air seemed to pulse with energy, and I sensed a terrible loneliness, a desperate yearning for release. I slowly turned my head, hoping to glimpse the source, but all remained black. I reached out, trembling, and felt nothing but cold emptiness. The oppressive silence returned for a brief moment before a sudden, low moan reverberated through the room, a sound so raw, so filled with sorrow that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the prison. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized and horrified all at once. The presence hovered just beyond reach, a prisoner still chained by the weight of memories and pain. As minutes passed, the whispers faded and the cold began to recede, though the heaviness lingered like a dark cloud. Slowly, my flashlight flickered back to life, casting feeble light around the cell's corners. The room appeared empty now, but the experience left an indelible mark on my soul. I retreated from cell 13, heart pounding, breath uneven. The corridor outside felt lighter, yet the echo of that dark encounter followed me like a shadow. I realized that within these walls, the boundary between life and death blurred, and that some souls were too tethered to the pain of their past to ever find peace. That night's experience was the most harrowing so far, a visceral encounter with a darkness that was not just physical but spiritual, a prison within a prison. It deepened my understanding that these haunting presences were not malicious spirits, but trapped victims, crying out for recognition, for release, and for someone to hear their story. As I walked away, the cold air still clinging to me, I knew my journey had only scratched the surface of the mysteries held within this place. Many more secrets, many more restless spirits awaited me in the shadows, waiting to reveal their truths. The prison was alive, in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The night had grown deeper, and the prison's oppressive silence was punctuated only by the faint rustle of my footsteps on the cracked concrete floor. I found myself drawn to a small, forgotten room near the heart of the facility, a place that felt different somehow. The air inside was thicker, charged with a palpable energy that seemed to hum beneath the surface, a residual echo of countless moments long since passed. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight flickering as it tried to penetrate the dense darkness. The walls were covered in peeling paint and faded graffiti, names, dates, desperate messages scrawled in hurried handwriting. Each mark told a story, a fragment of the lives that had once inhabited this forsaken place. I could almost hear their voices, carried faintly on the stale air. Settling into a corner, I turned off my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust. In the enveloping darkness, the silence became a canvas for something more. The faintest murmurs began to stir, whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At first, they were unintelligible, a susurration of sounds that could have been mistaken for the shifting of air or the settling of the old building. But gradually, distinct voices emerged, soft and sorrowful, carrying the weight of forgotten memories and unresolved pain. I strained to listen, holding my breath as the whispers swirled around me, phrases broken and incomplete, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting fractured lives. Words of regret, cries for mercy, and pleas for forgiveness floated through the air, tinged with a despair so profound it felt almost physical. My heart pounded as I realized I was not merely hearing echoes. I was witnessing the lingering consciousness of those who had suffered here, their stories etched into the very fabric of this place. The whispers seemed to call out, begging to be acknowledged, to be understood. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a small recorder and switched it on, hoping to capture this spectral choir. As the device hummed softly, the voices grew clearer, weaving a tapestry of sorrow and longing that transcended time. I closed my eyes, allowing the whispers to wash over me. Images flashed behind my eyelids, fleeting glimpses of faces twisted in anguish, hands reaching through iron bars, silent tears tracing paths down weathered cheeks. It was as if the prison itself was revealing its soul through these fragmented voices. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my skin. The air thickened, and the whispers grew urgent, overlapping in a haunting crescendo. I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as if the pain and suffering of those long gone had seeped into me, intertwining our spirits across the gulf of time. Opening my eyes, I found myself trembling, tears welling unbidden. The ghosts of the past had spoken, not in words I could fully understand, but in emotions so raw and vivid they transcended language. I whispered into the darkness, "I hear you. I see you. You are not forgotten." For a moment, the room was silent once more, the weight of the voices lifting like a breath released after a long-held sorrow. The air felt lighter, and a faint warmth returned, as though the spirits had found a moment of peace through acknowledgement. Rising slowly, I switched my flashlight back on. The walls, once forbidding and cold, seemed somehow less oppressive. Yet, the experience left an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder that the prison's true haunting lay not in the shadows, but in the unspoken stories of its inhabitants. As I stepped back into the corridor, the whispers faded, replaced by the familiar creaks and groans of the aging structure. but the memory of their voices lingered, a chorus of echoes that would accompany me on the nights to come. And I knew that my journey was far from over. The prison still held many secrets, many voices waiting to be heard. By the 8th night in the abandoned prison, I had come to expect the unexpected. The building, with all its decaying walls and shattered windows, seemed to breathe and shift in ways that defied logic. That night, I entered a section of the prison I had avoided until then, the old cell block known for its strange and unexplained occurrences. What happened inside would forever alter my perception of the supernatural and the thin veil that separates our world from the next. The corridor stretched before me like a tunnel swallowed by shadows. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, and the faint glow of my flashlight struggled to penetrate the oppressive darkness. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I moved forward, each step stirring tiny clouds of dust that hung in the stagnant air. The silence was so complete it felt almost unnatural, as if the very fabric of time was holding its breath. As I passed a small wooden table tucked into a corner, I suddenly noticed it shift. At first, it was subtle, a gentle slide across the floor, barely perceptible over the sound of my own breathing. My heart jumped. There was no breeze, no vibration, nothing to explain why the table moved at all. Slowly, it slid further, as if pushed by an unseen force. I stopped and stared, barely daring to breathe. The table moved back and forth, its legs scraping softly against the concrete. Then, without warning, a few wooden chairs nearby began to slide as well, their movements more erratic and sudden. They scraped loudly against the floor, clattering in a ghostly rhythm that echoed through the empty hallways. My flashlight flickered wildly as I aimed it at the strange spectacle, hands trembling as I pulled out my camera to record the phenomenon. Suddenly, several heavy iron cell doors swung open on their own. The metallic clang reverberated through the prison, a sharp and jarring noise that shattered the thick silence. The doors moved slowly at first, then with more force, slamming against the stone walls with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the energy in the air surge, as if the prison was waking, responding to some long-forgotten call. I kept filming, my heart racing. The energy surrounding me was palpable, dense and electric, like static before a storm. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I sensed an invisible presence all around, watching, moving, asserting its dominance over the place. Suddenly, a chair was hurled violently across the room, crashing into the wall with a deafening bang. The noise startled me so much that I stumbled backward, breath caught in my throat. The force of the throw was powerful, unlike anything that could be caused by a simple draft or accidental movement. The chair's violent journey seemed fueled by rage and desperation, emotions that transcended the physical world. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the atmosphere thick with tension and unseen forces. I could feel eyes piercing through the darkness, unseen but undeniably present. The weight of centuries of sorrow, anger, and fear pressed down upon me, wrapping around my spirit like a heavy cloak. Despite the fear clawing at my mind, I was compelled to stay. This place was more than an abandoned structure. It was a nexus where the living and the dead intersected, where memories and emotions lingered long after bodies had perished. The moving objects were manifestations of those trapped souls, their frustrations and cries made tangible through the veil. Gradually, the room settled. The objects ceased their restless movements. The heavy doors slammed shut once more, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Yet, the oppressive atmosphere lingered, a reminder that the prison's ghosts were never truly at rest. That night's experience left me shaken, but profoundly aware of the prison's haunted legacy. It was a place where history was alive, where the past reached out with invisible hands to remind the present of its presence. As I left the cell block, the echo of the crashing chair still rang in my ears, a haunting soundtrack to a night I would never forget. The shadows around me seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if waiting for the next chapter of this spectral tale to unfold. The night air inside the prison was unlike any cold I had ever felt. As I moved through the winding corridors, a sudden drop in temperature enveloped me, sharper and more biting than the chill that had followed me since my first step onto the grounds. It wasn't just a physical cold. It was a deep, penetrating freeze that seeped into every bone and fiber of my being, threatening to consume me whole. My breath came in shallow, visible puffs as I pressed forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling with each heartbeat. The walls around me seemed to close in, the dark shadows thickening until they felt suffocating. I could sense an invisible force pressing down from above, an unbearable weight that crushed not just my body, but my very spirit. Every step became a struggle. It was as if the air itself conspired to hold me back, dragging me down into the abyss. My muscles burned with the effort, but still, I moved forward, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. The darkness was absolute, not just the absence of light, but a tangible presence, dense and unyielding. My ears caught faint whispers carried on the frigid air, voices so low and distant I could barely make out their meaning. They were the voices of the lost, trapped forever in this place of despair. Suddenly, a low moan echoed through the corridor. It was a sound of pure anguish, a cry that seemed to resonate from the very walls. The moan grew louder, swelling into a chorus of sorrowful wails that filled the air and wrapped around me like a shroud. My heart pounded fiercely as I struggled to breathe beneath the crushing pressure. The invisible weight pressed harder, and I felt as though invisible hands gripped my shoulders, holding me fast. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm, inching forward despite the overwhelming force. The coldness deepened, numbing my fingers and toes, spreading relentlessly until it felt as though I was being consumed by ice. Yet, amidst the despair, there was an eerie stillness, a moment suspended in time where the living and the dead seemed to meet. I could sense a presence near, something vast and ancient, filled with pain and fury. It was a darkness that went beyond the physical, a spirit bound by rage and sorrow, refusing to move on. Despite the terror, a strange clarity emerged. I realized I was witnessing the prison's true heart, the raw, unfiltered suffering that lingered long after the final prisoner had left. The crushing pressure and freezing cold were manifestations of that pain, echoes of lives broken and souls trapped. Drawing on every ounce of strength, I pushed forward, my breath ragged, muscles trembling. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, but I kept my focus, knowing that to stop was to surrender to the darkness. Gradually, the weight began to ease, the cold retreating like a tide pulling back from the shore. The moaning faded into silence, and the oppressive presence lifted just enough for me to catch my breath. Exhausted but alive, I leaned against the wall, letting the warmth slowly return to my limbs. The experience left a mark on me deeper than any scar, a reminder of the invisible battles fought within these walls, and the resilience of the human spirit even in the darkest places. As I continued my journey through the prison, I carried with me the memory of that night, a night when I glimpsed the true nature of the prison's haunting and the depth of the sorrow it held. The final night inside the prison was nothing short of surreal. As dusk gave way to an ink-black sky, the building seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Each brick, each cracked window whispering tales of pain and suffering that had accumulated over centuries. I knew that this night would mark the climax of my journey, the moment where all the shadows, whispers, and spectral presences I had encountered would converge, demanding confrontation. Stepping into the darkened wing, a chill unlike any I had previously felt wrapped around me, penetrating deep beyond my coat and skin. The very air shimmered with a dense, almost electric energy. My flashlight's beam quivered as I carefully navigated the narrow corridors, the silence shattered only by my uneven breaths and the distant drip of water echoing through the prison's bones. I arrived at a small, isolated room, one I had passed many times but never entered. Tonight, however, something compelled me forward, a magnetic pull I could not resist. The walls of the room were cracked and stained, the floor littered with debris and dust thick enough to dull sound. The weak glow of my light revealed faded inscriptions carved into the stone, remnants of desperate messages left by forgotten prisoners. Settling cautiously into a corner, I prepared myself for what I hoped and feared to experience. Moments passed in suffocating silence, punctuated only by my own heartbeat pounding like a drum in my ears. Then, abruptly, a gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight's beam and plunging me into total darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The darkness was suffocating, thick like velvet, yet alive, shifting and swirling around me like a living entity. In the black void, a figure began to materialize, emerging slowly from the shadows. It was a man, his features pale, gaunt, and etched with lines of suffering. His eyes burned with an intense, almost desperate light, locked onto mine with a ferocity that sent a shiver racing through my spine. He wore the tattered uniform of a prisoner, stained with time and sorrow. This was the presence I had felt all along, the restless spirit that haunted the very heart of the prison. He did not speak, but his gaze conveyed a torrent of emotions: anguish, longing, defiance, and a faint glimmer of hope. It was as if he was trying to communicate across the chasm of death, to share the story of a life cut short and a soul trapped between worlds. I stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of his presence. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with an electric charge that made my skin tingle. Time slowed, the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms blurring into nothingness. Then, slowly, a warmth began to spread through me, counteracting the pervasive cold. It was a comforting presence, a balm to the ancient wounds carried by this spirit. I felt a connection. A bridge of understanding formed in the silence between us. The apparition's features softened, and I sensed a release, a momentary peace breaking through centuries of torment. Though he did not speak, I understood that this encounter was a farewell, a final moment of grace for a soul long imprisoned by pain. As the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows from which he had come, the room grew still once more. The darkness lifted slightly, and the faintest glimmer of dawn's first light seeped through the broken windows. Rising slowly, I stepped out of the room, the oppressive weight of the prison's haunted history feeling lighter somehow. The journey through the shadows had changed me. It had revealed not only the horrors of the past, but also the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest places. As I made my way toward the prison's exit, the rising sun cast long beams of light across the courtyard. The darkness retreated, and with it, the prison's grip seemed to loosen. I felt a quiet gratitude for survival, for understanding, and for the stories that had been shared with me in whispers and shadows. This was more than a ghost story. It was a testament to lives lived and lost, to suffering endured and remembered. It was a journey into the heart of darkness and back into the light. Thank you for joining me on this haunting journey. May we all learn to listen to the silent stories hidden in the shadows and honor those whose voices have long been forgotten. Until the next story.